August the 1st, 1942.
And your location of birth?
I was born in the old Patton Hospital in Hendersonville.
And your current address?
I presently live at 106 Blackstone Court in Flat Rock.
Okay, and your spouse's name?
Rebecca Ann Ginn, but she goes by Becky.
Okay, and your parents' names?
Of course, my father was Edwin Leland, and my mother was Anna Elizabeth Neighbors.
Anna Elizabeth?
Yes.
What was her last name?
Neighbors, N-A-B-E-R-S.
N-A-B-E-R-S?
E-R-S.
I want to make sure I have that spelled correctly. Okay, and are you considered a native of Saluda? You grew up in Saluda?
I grew up in Saluda. I guess I'm a native from the time I was 1 week old.
Okay, okay. Oh, and do you have children?
Yes, I have 5 children.
5 children. Would you like to give their names?
The oldest is Edwin Leland III. Then Anna Margaret Leland. Then Aaron Whitney Leland. Tilia Christine Leland. And Stacy Elizabeth Leland. Excuse me. I had a touch of pneumonia about 3 weeks ago, and so
Would you like to, let's put some water nearby?
if you had a little glass of water available.
Joey, is there one around that goes good? Be careful on the on that cord. They usually keep some around. Okay, they usually keep some here.
So now when I talk, it gets real dry.
Okay. Do you have brothers and sisters?
I have 2 older sisters,
2 older sisters? Okay, and what are their names?
Susan Ann Leland Hooker and Nancy Elizabeth Leland Barnett.
All right. Well, let's start. I know you're very interested in genealogy, and you've done extensive research into the history of your family. Let's talk about that, and I'm going to let you take the lead as to where you want to start. If you want to start with your parents and go back, or I'll let you just take the lead with that.
Well, the easy way to understand it is to start with my parents and go backwards. My father was born in January the 4th, 1905 in Charleston County, South Carolina, up near McClellanville. And like a lot of low country people, they like to come to the mountains in the summertime because it was so hot, and mosquitoes and everything. And his mother's brother had purchased what is now the Saluda Inn. And they started coming up there in the summer. And when their father died, 1917, which was my great-grandfather, or great-great-grandfather, when they settled the estate, they gave that house to my grandmother. And they kept most of the land down in Charleston because she needed an income. You'll have to edit all those coughing out. And so in 1914, they moved to, spent their first summer in Saluda at what is now the Saluda Inn. At the time, it was much smaller. But they added on to it and it became the Charlton Leland Hotel. And it was operated for 44 years, until 1944. So it's about 30 years they operated it. I personally still have the ledger where everybody signed in and who stayed there. And it's very interesting. Started off with a lot of relatives coming up from Charleston, and then everybody from everywhere would show up. And so that's how she made a little money during the summer. In the winter, they would go back to McClellanville and stay the winter down there. And my father never liked the low country to live there. It's too hot. And as soon as he was old enough, he stayed up here. probably starting around 1921 or 22. He didn't go back McClellanville. He stayed here, and I believe one of the first things he did was open a little radio repair shop. He was always interested in electronics, and I've seen old advertisements where he would fix or work on your radio, anything of that nature. And of course, he also took up being an electrician and wiring houses. Back then, you didn't need a license. You didn't need any kind of training. You just decided you wanted to do something, and you did it. So many of the houses that were built around this town, I think by Richard Thompson, he was one of the early carpenters. My dad probably wired most of those houses, the old ones. Started off with old knob and tube. And I remember when I started helping him, we still used to solder all the joints and melt lead, and had a little lead pot. We would solder every joint and tape it. Of course, now that's against the code. You can't do anything like that. It all has to be wire wrapped with wire nuts. But I remember that. So
back to what's now the Saluda Inn. It was called the Charlton.
The Charlton Leland Hotel. Charlton.
And how's the Charlton?
Charlton is my dad's dad.
Oh.
He was Charlton Henry Leland. And he died in 1922, I think, when my daddy was only 17. And that's why my grandmother needed a source of income.
So your grandmother ran the Charlton Leland?
Yes.
And how long did she run it?
From 1914 to 1944.
And is she the one that had it added on to?
Yes. Well, I think when he added on to it, her husband was probably still alive. I don't really know that for a fact, but it was Dr. Golette's old house.
Right.
And I've seen pictures of it right when they bought it. And they actually had a postcard with the Charlton Leland Hotel on it. And then the pictures of it later, which you could tell the back part of it was an addition.
So that was put in probably, they bought it in 1914, so somewhere around in there, you think they did?
I think they didn't add on to it probably to around the early 1920s, when they started making a little money as far as they were able to realize they needed a bigger place.
And so it started out kind of being a retreat for your family.
Yes.
And then it ended up they started taking in guests.
Right. She started doing that for an income.
And do you recall any good stories about the operation of the Charlton Leland Company? Yes.
Well, I haven't gone over the old hotel register. There were no unique guests that I saw there, famous people or anything that signed in. And I don't remember any tales about that, because it was closed when I was 2 years old.
Well, right, yeah.
And I do remember, the only thing I remember about it was my mother said that was the first time she ever saw my father, and this is the way she put it, he was slinking up the stairs in the hotel. I don't know what she meant by that, but he was not an outgoing person. He was very friendly, but he wasn't a gregarious person, and he liked to stay in the shadows, but he did a lot for everybody that nobody knew about, and even when he was younger, he didn't want any credit for anything, and so he was sort of sneaking up the stairs. He didn't want to interfere or bother anybody. That's the first time she saw him, she said.
All right.
Tell us about buying the telephone company.
Well, since he was in the radio repair business, and this was after the Depression, and the phone company had gone to 16 telephones, and it was It was owned by a company called Appalachian State Telephone Company, and I'm not sure, don't remember exactly where they were from. They owned several telephone companies, small ones. And he said, somebody said to him, Ed, why don't you just buy that company? He said, you ought to be able to run it. And he said, well, that's not a bad idea. And who that was, who told him that, I don't remember. Whether he told me their name, I'm not sure. So he and his brother Michael excuse me, got the money together because he didn't have $700 to buy the company. So Uncle Mike put in $350 and he put in $350, and they bought it in 1936, November 30. Well, maybe it was October, because he got married in November of 36. So my mother was with him the whole time, he owned the phone company. And after a few years, Uncle Mike wasn't interested in electronics and that type of stuff, and he was really never around, so they struck a deal where Daddy got Uncle Mike's half of the phone company, and in return, Uncle Mike got Daddy's half of the Packlet Falls track that they owned. It was a tract of land down Packlet River, including the falls, that a power company had purchased, thinking they would build a dam and generate power there.
Now, where is the Packlet Falls? Where are the Packlet Falls?
Well, you go out Mine Mountain Road, go past Mountain Page Baptist Church and turn left down on Mountain Page Road, cross the river. Well, actually, you can stop and walk down the river to the falls, but you don't want to get to that takes you to the top of the falls. You go on past the river to the first road to the right, where there's a little log cabin that my sister owns.
So the first road to the right?
No, excuse me, first road to the left.
To the left.
And then,
Right in that curve.
right in the curve, horseshoe curve going up Mine Mountain. You can walk down that road and it'll take you to the falls, but of course that's all private property. You probably need my sister's.
The falls you can see from 176?
No.
Well, I'm kind of getting off track here, but I've got to know, when you're in the wintertime and you're heading towards Tryon, you can see the big falls. What falls?
Well, I always call them Tootsie Roll Falls. Do you ever?
Some people call it Melrose Falls.
Melrose Falls. Well, Tootsie Roll is probably the falls that's right on the side of the river. It goes under the road and goes under the river. Under the road.
Right, and the little one.
The little one. And then when you look off to the right, it's really not Melrose Falls because that's on down. But I never really called them anything.
Oh, okay. Well, sorry to get off track, but
Uh,
so go ahead back with your
my
story.
That's a little bit how my father got here. Of course, he never left. Often here, except to visit on occasion. My mother moved up here from Fingerville, South Carolina in 1920, and she was 4 years old. And her father built the little house on Seminary Street in the curve right past the schoolhouse. No, it's on past that. It's on at the curve. It's where there's a sign on it now that says not for sale. It has sort of gotten it's gotten into a lot of disrepair, but it's owned by my mother's sister's daughter. That's where Evelyn Hall lives.
So now,
My mother, from the time she was 4 years old,
lived in that house.
lived in that house. Still in the family, yes. It's
Sometime I'd like to.
nobody lives there now. Well, Melanie is her name that owns it. I forget her last name. She lives in Florida. But so that's where my mother grew up. And her father became a butcher, and he had a little meat market down where the Macon Bank is now. And I don't know that there's any pictures of that place exist, but that's one thing he did. He was a butcher.
What was the name of the business?
I don't know. It was just public meat market. And his name was James Alexander Neighbors. And his father, and one of the sons of my mother's younger brother, was the same name, but and he lived here for many years. And the other children were a little older, except Aunt Evelyn, who lived in that house that I was telling you about. And so they came up from Spartanburg County, and were glad to get out of the heat.
So most of your family came up from South Carolina?
All of them from South
All of them
Carolina.
came from
Yeah.
South Carolina. Okay.
Yeah, the first Leland came to Charleston in 1809. He was born in Massachusetts. He had a college education in 1809. Came to Charleston because it was high society, and it was really a place to be if you wanted to come south at that time. And he married the daughter of the richest man in Mount Pleasant, who used to own all of Mount Pleasant, South Carolina. He ran a ferry across the river, the Cooper River, and owned plantations. And the truth is also he owned 255 slaves that operated his ferry and worked his plantation. That doesn't mean it's right, but that's the way it was back then, and he had more than his share.
What was his name?
His name was James Hibben,
Can you spell that last name?
Hibben, and he was a captain. I think it was an honorary title during the War of 1812. And when the capital of South Carolina moved from Charleston to Columbia, he was in charge of the company that moved the gold that the state had from Charleston to Columbia. And that's how trusted a man he was. And but most of his sons were anti-slavery and moved up north and didn't want to inherit, his plantations or his slaves because they didn't agree with it. And so there's nobody of the Hibben name living in South Carolina now. But this Leland that came to South Carolina was a Presbyterian preacher and theologian, and was a professor at the Columbia Theological Seminary in Columbia. And he lived there from 1838 till he died in 1871. And his house on Gervais Street in Columbia was one of the few houses that did not burn to the ground when Sherman burned Columbia. And the reason it didn't burn is because they took the rugs up off of the floor. All the rooms had rugs in them. They carried up on the roof, and they doused them with water, and they kept them wet. So when the sparks would land on the roof, they would go out, because all the roofs were wood shingles, dry wood shingles. And actually, Dr. Leland, they called him, because he was a PhD in religion. At the time the house of Columbia burned, he had had a stroke and was in the bed. I didn't know it. He carried his bed out in the yard, and when they were trying to save the house, and he actually still had 6 house slaves at the end of the war that his wife had inherited, which they took care of there in Columbia.
And his Aunt Susan is the one that did the Saluda magazines in the 30s.
Yeah. Sue Annie,
Do you have copies of that?
I have, I guess, the only known copies of the originals. I have all of them, 1 copy of each. And I'm the one that loaned them to Charlene and her group when they had them reprinted.
I think you give me permission to do
Oh,
something like
oh,
that.
yeah,
We'll
I
talk
want-
about that later.
I want them all. Anything that I have that can be
comes down and you know the importance of what was passed to you, and you want to share that with others, so I can understand why you were interested in this. But I'll let you, well, maybe now's a good time to talk about, you've written a book, or you've compiled a book on the Heatherly side of your family. Would you like to talk a little bit about why you did that and describe the book for us?
It's sort of interesting because the Heatherlys are not my family.
Oh, the Heatherlys are not your family?
No, the Heatherlys,
Oh, okay.
my mother-in-law was a Heatherly.
I see.
And as I was always interested in genealogy, when I found that out, I said, well, I grew up with some Heatherlys. And she said, well, my daddy was born in Greenville, and that's all I know, really. She said, my sisters have done a little work, and so I got some copies of what they had. And it turns out that, of course, her Heatherly family comes right back up to Green River Township.
What is your mother-in-law's name?
Her name was Christine Heatherly, and she married Evan DeWitt Ginn, who was my father-in-law.
Ginn?
Ginn. He was one of the finest men that I ever knew, second only to my father, because he was just a great guy. So,
What was his name again?
Evan DeWitt Ginn.
E-V-I-N?
Yeah.
DeWitt, W-I-H-I?
No, just D-E-W-I-T-T, DeWitt. Yeah. And so he was always encouraging me to look up about Christine, see what you can find. So I started the Heatherly research. I went back as far as I could to this John Heatherly that lived over in Tuxedo. And I said, well, I might as well trace all his descendants because I grew up with a bunch of them. And so I did this most the old-fashioned way.
So the book is in the 5th revision.
5th revision because I have it printed. It's on a Word document, and I can easily go in and make corrections and revisions and additions. And I only print it about 10 to 15 or 20 copies at a time. So when I find additional information, I update my Word document and have it printed at Staples. And then I have a binding machine. I bind it myself. And so I just had some Alabama cousins order 10 books, so I just printed the 5th revision. It's more than an interest, it's a passion to me, doing this type of research. And I've got tons of it on the Lelands, which I need to publish a book on them.
Well, back to the Heatherly, where did they come from?
Well, the first Heatherly came into Baltimore, Maryland in about 1700. Came from England because he spelled his name Hatherley, H-A-T-H-E-R-L-Y.
I'd like for you to talk about Heatherly Heights and how Heatherly Heights became named Heatherly Heights, and a little bit about the man that Heatherly Heights was named for.
That's a man named John Ripley Heatherly. And I don't know exactly when he purchased that property. Grew up in Clemson. Right there where Lake Summit is. On the old Heatherly property under the water. At some point in time, he migrated over to Mountain area. It's all still being in the township. Purchased that property, Heatherly Heights. And he was a Baptist circuit rider, preacher. And he might have seen that mountain but he did understand he did ride a white horse. And people would see preacher Heatherly coming from a distance, sitting straight in his saddle, riding that white horse. They recognized him. This is information that I came down from members of his descendants. But he bought that property, and as a way to make some money, he built a tower up there, observation tower. And when they were building the railroad, a lot of the timber was cut off of these mountains during that time. And you could see from the top of Heatherly Heights all the way to Lake Summit, or what was to become Lake Summit, and where they built the train track. And he would take people in carriages from downtown Saluda to Heatherly Heights and charge them a dime for the ride, and then to go up in the observation tower and see the construction of the railroad and just to see the view. And that's where he had a house up there somewhere, a big white two-story house. I don't know if it was way on the top of the mountain, probably not, because back then people had enough sense not to build on the top of a mountain because of the north wind and the cold wind that blew. They hunted somewhere that would offer protection from the elements, because they had no insulation in the walls, even the big old houses. So, and I have seen the minutes of the Mud Creek Baptist Church when he was actually ordained to preach. And one of the people who examined him was Aaron Heatherly, who was my wife's ancestor, who was also a part-time Baptist preacher. Even though I can find no record of him ever ministering at a local church, he did attend most of the conferences they had and represented Mud Creek, and did perform marriages in Henderson County. I've seen that. And so he examined his nephew. John Ripley Heatherly was his brother's son. And that was in about 1877. I'm not exactly sure of the date.
But John Ripley Heatherly was not the minister of Mud Creek.
No, he was never.
He was a circuit rider.
He was a circuit.
What exactly can you explain what a circuit rider minister is?
Well, a lot of these churches couldn't afford a minister full time, even though you didn't pay him but very little. And what he would do and a lot of them didn't have services every Sunday. And so he would go to one church one Sunday and another church the other Sunday and hold services for groups of people.
Did he visit people in their homes and that kind of thing too?
Most probably, but I don't know exactly what he did. I mean, he made me his living mainly from just subsistence farming like most people did back then, and hunting.
Now, John Ripley Heatherly served in the Civil War for the Confederacy.
Yes, he did. He was lucky. He was not a member of the 64th Regiment that was captured at Cumberland Gap and taken to camp in Chicago. I know the name of it well, he had several brothers and cousins that were in that regiment. They were captured, and 4 of them died in that prisoner of war camp. Luckily, John Ripley was in a different regiment. He was wounded at the Battle of Seven Pines, which was part of the Peninsula Campaign, southeast of Richmond, and then later was captured. I forget exactly at what battle, but he did most of his fighting in Virginia and was taken to Hart's Island in New York, as a prisoner of war. When he was released, he probably had to walk most of the way home back to North Carolina because the U.S. government did not provide transportation, and most of the railroads were destroyed. Unfortunately, he didn't leave any written record of his Civil War experiences, as 99% of the people didn't. It was something they wanted to forget and move on, because it was a horrible war.
Well, on a lighter note, after the Civil War, and you had mentioned the house somewhere on Heatherly Heights, he owned, I guess, a spring on top of the mountain, or a water source that was able to supply Saluda with water. Is that correct?
There was a water source up there, a spring that was somehow the city of Saluda got title to that property, the old Ripley Heatherly property. And so when Saluda decided they wanted their own water source, and I'm not sure of the date, I think it was the late teens, early 20s, when things were booming, real estate was booming in western North Carolina, they piped water from that spring all the way to Saluda in a terracotta pipe that was put together joints at a time, and the joints were about 2 feet pieces of pipe, and they laid it all the way from Heatherly Heights. Part of it is visible on the lower part of Orchard Hill, where it comes around where Kenneth Pace property, in that corner, where there's a sign now that says Nestor's Curve or something. That's where the water line came, right around that curve. And I've seen in the past that terracotta pipe visible there. And it piped it to I guess a water tower somewhere. I'm not sure of that. But that was the source of Saluda's water until we got, plus we had a lake down at the end of Packlet Street. What's the name of that lake, Charlie? I forget. It had a name.
Did the city own it?
City owned that.
City Lake. I've heard others talk about the city.
The
Lake.
city, and it had a nice concrete built dam, and it had a pumping station down there that they pumped water to a water tower or just back into the lines, because my father used to go down there and work on those big motors. I remember going with him in that pump house.
Well, let's talk about your father's family.
Great.
Your father was mayor of Saluda, and is that correct?
Yes, he was.
And you were mayor of Saluda.
I was mayor of Saluda. It was something that my father did because he believed in community service. He didn't want to be mayor because the title of mayor or any kind of honor that it might have brought to him, because he shunned those kind of recognitions. But he always stepped up to the plate when something needed to be done. And so somebody said, well, Ed, you need to be mayor. You run, we'll get you elected. And that's what he did. And he was that mayor for 4 years. And I remember, the only controversy I remember when he was mayor was that was the time they replaced this bridge, right, with a concrete bridge going over the railroad track. We had an old wooden bridge there.
1966.
Yeah, and so, and I was actually in the service then, because I got out of the service in 1968, but I came back to Saluda one summer or something, where that was going on, when they were replacing that bridge. And
That's when we had 2 traffic lights in Saluda.
And they put I think they put a temporary bridge off to one side, or maybe they used the old bridge for a while.
They used the old bridge.
One-way traffic though, wasn't it?
Yes, and they had a light over in front of the barbecue and one down here at Greenville Street.
Why was
Okay.
that controversial?
Well, what happened for some reason, of course the trains ran then a lot, and the train would stop right here in Saluda. It would block Greenville Street, and it would block the crossing down where the old depot used to be. The only way you could get across was if that bridge was operating. Well, for some reason, the bridge was closed. I don't remember what it was. And traffic was backed up for miles and miles both directions. Daddy was the mayor. So they said, Ed, you got to do something about it. So Ed and all the city commissioners went to City Hall. What can we do, They got on the phone to Southern Railway. I don't remember how it got resolved or why the bridge was not, but there was a man on Main Street who was about as mad as any man that I've ever seen. Ranting and raving and up and down the street. And he didn't know who I was. And like my father, I'm pretty much a peacemaker. And if I can avoid a confrontation, I will. But I couldn't avoid this one because he was having some very unpleasant things to say about my father in an unpleasant and derogatory way. And I remember the only time I ever lost my temper that I can remember, I got up in his face and told him who I was and told him if something he didn't, in essence, shut up, that there was something was going to happen on Main Street between me and him. And I wasn't going to be responsible for what the results were. And I would have been scared to death to get in a fight because I never was in one, but I was ready. And he shut up and backed down and left. And somehow the controversy, either the bridge got reopened or they moved the train, but they made some arrangements after that didn't happen. But
Well, that's good if that's the only controversy he had during his term.
well, that's the only one I knew about because I was in the military during most of the time he was mayor.
Okay.
And
You in the Air Force?
I was in the Air Force. Because I went to Clemson and ROTC and I took a commission as a lieutenant. I became an engineer on the Minuteman missile. And so most of those missiles are now non-existent and those sites don't even exist anymore. But back to my father, he was also the first president of the Saluda Lions Club when it was formed. He was the zone chairman in the Lions Club, and he did all the volunteer work he could do. He was on the Polk County School Board for a while. He was on the Isothermal Community Development Commission. Any way he thought he could help Saluda, he did it. And he never sought any personal recognition for it. He just, whatever I can do.
And now he served, what were the years that he was mayor?
Well, around late 60s, yes, something like that. 64 to 68. We could check out City Hall exactly.
And now you were mayor from, what were the years?
I can't even remember exactly, but it was
70s and 80s?
yeah, the mid-70s to the early 80s,
Okay.
because I was the mayor when we had this centennial celebration in 1981.
And that was the only father and son mayor Saluda's ever had.
So,
And your father bought the telephone company in 1936.
yes.
And then in 1945, do you remember when he put in the dial system?
Well, no, in 45 I was 3 years old.
He was a little boy.
But he got a priority somehow and got some automatic electric step equipment, 200 lines of it, and put it in one line at a time. So half the people were on the old operator system and half were on the dial until he converted completely. And a lot of people really didn't like that because they liked to talk to the operator. But my mama got tired of being the operator.
Your mother was the operator.
She was it for part of the time. And there was another lady who was the operator a long time. I know who she was.
Bertha Bishop was operator, and so was Lady Arledge, Fillmore's sister, Lady. I know of those two. And wasn't, at one time, the exchange was over for the police department, isn't it?
Yeah, it was upstairs over the police department. And
The exchange, the
Telephone
telephone
exchange.
exchange was above the City Hall building,
yes,
above the side, on the side of the police department.
yeah. I was, of course, way before my time. But
And her statement also was, I know of those.
Was the company located in another building?
well, no, that was the company. Wherever the switchboard was the company. I mean,
So
that.
it never was anywhere else other than the City Hall?
Well, it moved from the City Hall up to where back up Henderson Street, right there, that building my sister owns, right above the Pebble Dash building
Okay,
Church
that's where I thought it
on
was.
Church Street. Yeah, on Church. Half of that, that's the only building I ever remember. And he had the switchboard in there. That's where he put his first step equipment. in 1945. And they had an apartment up above it. So I think at some point it moved from the top of the city hall to the top of that building, because Mom and them lived in that apartment. Because I've got pictures of my older sisters playing out in the yard in front of that before the Gulf Station, any of that was built. That was just a little field. And so they were playing out there.
And after the post office moved, Ed moved his office down there to the old post office building.
Yeah, we rented that to have an office on Main Street. But it wasn't, the switching office always stayed in that building till it was shut down.
Then Chief Russell worked for him, and his mother didn't have to collect the phone bills anymore. Used to go by our house to pay the phone bill.
I remember as a little girl staying with my grandmother, when the phone would ring, there were several distinct rings, or it was either like maybe if it rang one time, or 2 times, or 3 times, depending, you knew when to pick up. And
As party line.
it was a party line, and so I thought we'd always have to wait for it to ring so many times before we could answer the phone, and I never understood that, and I was always picking the phone up on somebody else's conversation, and you could just listen. I mean, if you really wanted to be nosy, you could listen to your neighbor's conversations, which as a kid, of course, I did when I stayed with my grandmother. But that always was just fascinating to me that, you had to wait for your ring before you picked the phone up.
Yeah, I came back to work here in 1968 and we still had party lines. The 4-party was about as much. When he originally started running lines out in the country, I had some 8-party lines. They were never full, because it just wouldn't work. The people didn't live on their phone back then like they do now.
Just that,
Yes.
Say.
Right, just moved on. So, actually, we had a few party lines left when we sold the company in 1991. A couple 2-party lines down at Green River Cove, or way out the end of Macedonia.
That is amazing.
Yeah.
1991,
Yeah.
still on the party line.
Yeah, 2-party lines. A lot of them were summer people. It'd be somebody that wasn't here during the winter, but it was getting to the point then where people were getting a little irate. Everybody wanted a private line,
Yeah.
which I don't blame them. So,
Now, what's the story about occasionally when it would rain, you all would put plastic over my aunt used to say you put raincoats on your telephone lines, but it wasn't raincoats.
what we had was a lot of old lead cable back then, because that's what they had before they had plastic cover. And so Daddy had a couple lines that were lead cable. And when lightning would get in lead cable, it would burn the wires up. Well, then you had to get a hammer and chisel, open up the lead cable, repair the wires. And he never had time to resolder the lead cable, so actually he bought inner tubes, old tire inner tubes. Would cut them in pieces, and they would hang them over where the part was and put clothespins on them to hold them on there so they wouldn't get
So they
wet.
weren't raincoats, they were inner tubes.
They were inner tubes, yeah.
But it worked.
Yeah.
It worked. I mean, I remember one time we had a lightning storm in the winter, which is very rare, and it just ate up a bunch of that stuff. And we were repairing telephones for 3 weeks straight. And one guy in Green River Cove was out for a month. But they understood. Back then they said, well, get to it when you can, because we didn't charge them rent for that time. And it was just laid back time. Everybody got along with everybody just about and understood when things went wrong that you had no control over. But they appreciated a private line for $4.50 a month. And a party line was $2.75. We had one rate increase in 20 years. When I was working here from 1968 to 1991. And we raised the rate $1.60 when we put in extended area service from Saluda to Hendersonville. And that was
Let's repeat that. One rate
increase.
increase in 20 years.
actually,
Okay, he had
it was 16 telephones in 1936 when he bought them.
that were cranked.
They were all crank magneto type phones and worked through an operator. And that's the only kind you could get until 1945 when he went to dial system.
And those were those heavy telephones that had they were like really heavy to lift.
Yeah, they were the little cradle in the hand.
Yeah.
And they were 302s, we called them, Western Electric phones.
Was not,
Well, go ahead.
was not Saluda one of the first ones in North Carolina that had the dial system?
It was the first one along with Asheville that got dial system in 1945.
In North Carolina?
Yeah, in western North Carolina.
Western.
I don't know how far over, but we got it dial the same time Asheville did. Because we would have had to have a big switching center to work the dial lines through. Because the long distance circuits were maintained by AT&T, and they had a line running, actually it ran, part of it came right through the Saluda Cemetery, and it came down toward Melrose. It was 5 cross arms full of copper wire, and all the long distance went through. And I remember on occasion going out there with sticks, long sticks, and uncrossing those lines because we didn't have any service. And so you go uncross those lines. That was...
Let's talk about the picture board that you're sitting in front of.
Okay, before we do that, 'cause I'm gonna have to take it off the tripod, so I'll have to
Okay.
get the pictures. Is there anything else you want to talk to us about yourself, your family?
Well, no, but I would like to talk a little bit about Saluda in the summertime.
Yeah, and I was going to ask you that too. Is what was it like? What was Saluda like growing up here?
Well, I mean, it was really the good old days. Nobody locked their house. There was no crime. Everybody walked to school and lived in town, all the kids. Nobody worried about anybody bothering them or molesting them or anything like that. I mean, I spent my whole elementary school years just walking to school. Sometimes with a friend next door or my sisters or just by myself. And nobody worried about anybody back then. And it was, we didn't really have a lot. Nobody had a lot, but we thought we had enough. We had plenty. I mean, we had food to eat. We had a house to live in. It was nothing to worry about.
Did you graduate from Saluda High School?
Yes, I remember my first day at school in the first grade. My teacher was Dolly Hall, Beatty Hall's wife. She taught first grade forever. It's probably I don't know what year it was, but in the first grade, I remember it distinctly because they had tables in there. Everybody sat around the tables. And one guy got under the table, and we couldn't get him out from under the table. He was so bashful and shy.
You want to say that?
I really don't want to say who that is
Okay.
on this tape.
I think I've heard somebody else has mentioned that.
He's deceased now, but he never even graduated from high school. He was one of the boys out in the country and during the second grade, I actually spent half the year in Jacksonville Beach, Florida, because my older sister had asthma. But Mrs. Wren was the second grade teacher. The third grade teacher was Ms. John T. Coates, which I had. The fourth grade teacher escapes me totally. I cannot remember my fourth grade teacher.
Not Ruth Edwards?
No. Ruth Edwards was the fifth grade teacher.
Okay.
She taught the fifth grade forever. And she was mad at me most of her life because I skipped the 5th grade in Saluda. I went back to Folly Beach. We lived there my whole 5th grade because my sister was having asthma trouble. And so we lived there for that year. And she never let me forget the fact that she didn't have me in 5th grade. And I'm probably good because she was a pretty strict teacher, I understand. The 6th grade was a guy named Mr. Ramey, who just sort of came in and then left. And when it gets up into the 7th, 8th, 9th, and 10th, I remember Mrs. Pace, that lived out here right past seminary. You know where the old seminary building?
Miss Ruby Dan.
Yeah, Miss Dan Pace. Oh, she was something else. And we dreaded her class. And then she was 7th grade. 8th grade, I think, was Clyde Smith, who was a basketball coach. 9th grade in high school, I think 9th grade was Miss Lloyd Thompson. She taught typing. And I still have to hunt and peck, so I didn't learn much in that. And
Is that Betty Thompson?
Betty Jo. And also in there was Spencer, married the Bradley girl.
Spencer Reed.
Spencer Reed. He was in the 7th or 8th grade. I forget back and forth. Is he still living? Yeah, because he's been there forever. And then Ms. West was in high school, and the principal was Mr. Davis, who he had arthritis or something in his hands. But he was a genius, really, I mean, in mathematics. And he really taught me a lot in math. I remember that. But he was different. Everybody made fun of Mr. Davis, unfortunately, because but he had everybody's best interests in heart. Those are all the teachers I remember. But
Okay, so tell us a little bit more about your experiences with the Saluda High School and your days in high school.
well, I remember growing up, everybody wanted to hurry up and get to high school. You know, when you're young, you want your years to fly by, and when you get my age now, you wish things would slow down. But I don't remember the first day of high school, but I do remember how impressed I was going into the big rock building. And I get to change classes. I don't just stay with one teacher. And there were about 100 in high school the whole time I was in 9th through 12th grade. Except the class ahead of me only had 7 students in it. That was the class that had Harriet Johnson and J.D. Gilbert in it and a few others, but only had 7. Most classes had, 21 to 25, 26. Ours was one of the largest, about 26 or 7 students. I always wanted to play sports, and we had very little in elementary school other than recess. And only sport Saluda had was basketball. I tried to play a little baseball a few summers, but of course we weren't big enough for football. The only team that had a football team was in Tryon. And actually one of my best friends, Mike Thompson, transferred from Saluda to Tryon so he could play football. He was a year and a half older than I was. The reason I mentioned Mike was he was very athletic, but he loved scouting, and I loved the Boy Scouts. And Mike earned more merit badges than anybody in Saluda ever earned. He was the first Eagle in Saluda. Actually, he was the 3rd Eagle, but he was the first one since the 1920s. They had 2 Eagle Scouts, Junie Flowers, who was my first cousin, and I think Bobby Little. And then until Mike became Eagle, there was no more Eagle Scouts in Saluda. And that was probably in 1952 when he got to be Eagle, 52 or 3. And I made Eagle in 1955. So I was the 4th Eagle Scout. And Mike Thompson was one of the guys that encouraged me, of course, other than my mother, who wanted to make sure I made Eagle. And so I remember Mike a lot. He was a weightlifter. And he's the first person I ever saw with a mohawk. He was the only person who was brave enough in 1952 to have a mohawk on Main Street, because he weightlifted and everybody was afraid of him. But I've kept in touch with him over the years, but recently I don't know where he is. But back to high school, I got sort of off the subject there. But so I remember the first basketball game I ever went to. And as a freshman, of course, I didn't get to play. We went to this school, I don't remember the name of it. Rode the bus over there, and it was a gym smaller than our old gym. People were packed in there and looked like they were hanging out of the rafters and everything. And they had a bunch of big guys playing against them, and I think they beat us pretty bad. But that was my first taste. And Clark Thompson was on that team, the one you've been working with. And he was always harassing me and the younger guys. This is your first game and so forth. I do remember that. But later on, we had a good team, especially in 1958 and 59. We won the Polk County Championship. And that was me. Of course, I was 6'1", which was tall back then. And then Alan Pace, he was 6 foot. Hop Foster was on the team. Frankie Ashley and Jerry Pace. They were the two guards. And so we won that year, and Hop Foster was about the best player. He had the best shot. That's where his nickname come from, because he could hop around the basketball court and had a good jump shot. I think that's where it came from. Of course, he's still around. He was a great athlete.
I'll have to ask him if that tells you.
Yeah, I don't know really how he got it. That's where I thought it came from.
Yeah.
And so I've got to actually have a picture of that team that won the championship.
Did you bring it with you?
I brought it with me,
Okay.
so I'll show it to you. We didn't win the next year because Hop wasn't eligible to play, and neither was Frankie. And so we didn't have the firepower we had the year before. And I do also remember that when I was a senior, we went to one track meet up at Christ Church in Arden. And we practiced before going, because I always had an interest in track and jumping and high jumping, and not so much long distance running. But so we would build a high jumping pit in my next door in Allen's yard and try to get sawdust down there, and would practice. And so when I heard about this meet, I said, Coach, that was Clyde Smith, was the basketball coach, let's take some guys and go to the track meet. And so we showed up there at the track meet. Turns out that I got second in a high jump in Western North Carolina. And the guy that won was Duke Fisher from Tryon, who was 6'4". And he just barely beat me, and he'd been jumping a long time. Hop Foster got second in the broad jump. And some other guys, little Ralph got second in the chin up. They had a chin up back there. So we came back, little Saluda, won 3 or 4 medals up there, and never been to a track meet. And I just had talent to jump that I didn't know I really I was that good at it. So when I went to Clemson, I went and tried out and made the track team at Clemson. And ended up being Atlantic Coast Conference record holder in the long jump and the triple jump. And won a full scholarship before I graduated, just because I had an interest in something and tried to make something of it. That's so many people today just give up. They don't try. And who would think a little boy from Saluda could be the best long jumper in the Atlantic Coast Conference? And so I look at how far I jumped, 24 feet 5 inches, and I measured out on the ground now, and I thought, I get tired walking that far now. Not really, but it's just amazing what you can do if you set your mind to it.
So did you graduate from Clemson?
Yes.
What was your degree in?
electrical engineering. Because I always knew I was coming back to work with my father at the phone company.
And you did?
I did, after 4 years in the military.
How long did you work with your father?
23 years.
23 years?
23 years. But I worked, as a kid, we all expected to work.
Right.
On weekends and all, we were out helping him string line and cut right away and stuff like that. I do remember one time he got a lot of his wire, secondhand stuff from that Southern Bell would cast off. They would sell it to Lewis Williams for junk, and Daddy would go up there and buy it from Lewis Williams. And he would get these big rolls of wire, and they would all roll together, and we would have to roll them out, separate them, and then he would put them up the pole. I remember doing that a lot. But in summertime, he would make me work when I didn't want to work, because I wanted to go swimming in the summer down to Ogden's Pond. I'll go with my friend Sebring Jones that lived 2 houses away that came up every summer. They would go to Lake Summit every day. I wanted to go out there and swim with them. I wanted to go hiking. I wanted to get out in the woods because we had an old Jeep we drove around in. And I have to work. Of course, it was good for me. But the funnest thing, if there's such a word as that, to do in Saluda was the square dances.
Oh, yes. Tell us about the square dances. We hear a little bit about that.
They had a pavilion up here where the pavilion is now. It was an enclosed pavilion. And that's where they had the square dances on Friday night for the little kids. And my mama said I started dancing when I was 2 years old. I don't remember that, but I do remember square dancing in that pavilion every Friday night during the summer. And on Saturday night, they had the square dance at the gym, and that was for the big folks. And you couldn't go over there unless you were a certain age. They just wouldn't, it was just an unwritten rule.
You had to pay to get in.
You had to pay to get in. And so you had to have money. Yeah. But little kids, later on, I guess some of them tried it, but when I was growing up, the little kids didn't go. Every now and then they'd have a kid square dance over there. But in the summertime back then, people had summer homes up here from Columbia, Greenville, Spartanburg, Charleston, that they'd had in their family for years. And they would come up here and spend all summer. And the grandmas owned the houses, but the granddaughters came up here. And I remember all the good-looking summer girls that would come. I couldn't wait to go to square dancing with all the summer girls. And one of the things that the local girls would say, well, it's June, and we're getting out of school, I'm going to tell you goodbye, because I know you won't speak to me again till spring, till September. That was the joke, because that wasn't entirely true, but there was a little truth to it. We loved square dancing with all the summer girls that came up. And some would come up every year, and it just became a real good friend that you would dance with and look forward to seeing. And, for a 13, 14, 15, 16-year-old boy, that was exciting.
I bet it was.
And you couldn't, even though they came from Greenville, South Carolina, you never saw them again. Greenville was like being in another state. Nobody got in the car and went anywhere. And I remember one time this girl that I'd danced with for years, sort of became a girlfriend. And one time I got to go to Greenville with her and her sister and her mother. And I thought it was country come to town. I went to Greenville and saw where the city girl lived. And that was interesting.
There were a lot of families that came up every summer that was, they did it for their whole lives.
Right.
Do
They
any
had.
of those names, can you remember any of the summer folks' names? We've interviewed a few of them.
Not really.
Did you know the Twigs? Did you ever meet the Twigs?
Well, that name's familiar.
Yeah, the Bones and...
Gosh, I can't remember.
Well, we knew a lot of people through the telephone company.
Oh,
Yeah.
yeah.
And of course, they kept a phone most time year round. And they had to. That was part of the deal.
Yeah.
It was only $2.50 a month for a party line up there, so they could afford that. But
How did the summer folks get here? They come up on the train?
no, they came in cars, in the 40s and 50s. Before that, they came in trains, and they would stay all summer. And that's how my Leland relatives would come up from Charleston. They would catch the train and stay for 2 or 3 weeks and catch it and go back. But these people, the time I got to be a teenager, they came up in cars.
Well, I guess so, yeah.
And usually the father would still have his job or something. He would go back during the week, and he would only come up on the weekend a lot of times. But those summer square dances were fun.
Who were some of the musicians? Do you remember? What kind of, well, let me ask you.
Well,
this, what kind of music?
Bob Whitaker used to play some.
Oh, yeah? Uh-huh.
I mean, he could tell you a lot about the musicians. I remember the bands. It was the same one, but who it was, I don't know.
Was it the old-time kind of traditional music?
Yeah.
Bluegrassy
Bluegrass,
kind?
mountain music.
Traditional mountain music.
Play Down Yonder. That was one of the songs they played, the square dance to.
And was it when you say square dance, was it all, crew calling out, square dancing?
Yeah, but it wasn't Western type. You would circle up in fours sometimes and do things in fours, but mainly it was a big circle. And the old-fashioned square dance, and it wasn't. And there were 2 or 3 guys. Yeah, and 2 or 3 guys could clog, and they'd have these cloggers on their shoes. I know Ray, one of those Johnson boys. I can't remember him, but he loved to clog. Bobby Johnson, exactly who it was. And it was just a fun time. And the circle was so big it would take up the whole floor. And you'd swing your corner lady all the way around. It'd take about 10 minutes to get around the circle. And then when you swang the girl that you wanted to dance with the next dance, you hoped you got to her so you could ask her, And it was really fun. It was fun times, and it wasn't.
Well, the children's dances helped at the pavilion,
Yes.
and it's right where the picnic shelter is.
When did that, I don't remember that. When did that, when was that shelter, when was that torn down?
Well, it was still there when I was mayor. I think it was torn down when Nolan was mayor.
Was it covered? I mean, it was like enclosed?
Covered, and it had wooden windows on the side, and you would open them up, lift it up, and let the breeze blow through, and then if it was raining, you'd let them down. And we would play games up there. And Fred Aiken was such a card. He loved to be in charge, and he was funny, and he would play, what was the song? What's that game when you have to stop? Red light, green light. We'd play red light, green light, and then we'd play musical chairs, where they'd take a chair out every time. And the music stopped. And the music stopped, you had to find a seat, and whoever didn't find one was out. And all you did was win, and maybe you got to lead off the next dance or something like that. It was just such innocent fun.
Innocent fun. Just fun. Yeah. That's my memories of Saluda too, just coming up here.
We're going to look at our board that was revealed and unveiled during our 100-year celebration. And we had our first open house on February 16th, 1951. And Cater had this board done. And so this is a great history of Saluda. And so we don't talk about these pictures.
I remember when we decided to have a centennial celebration, we had a committee, and the North Carolina Department of Archives and History was very gracious in helping us. And we collected most of these pictures where we could. Charlene had a lot to do with collecting them, and along with Ann, what was her name?
Osborne.
Ann Osborne. and they're the ones behind writing the little history book. We all cooperated. And I was able to get the archives man to make this display. They blew up these pictures and mounted them at no cost to the city. And I'm glad to see that it is still in good repair and up here in the council meeting room for everybody to see. As one always been preserving it. Glad that this will preserve for generations to come.
Most of these pictures are in the centennial history, and they've been used from time to time in other publications too.
It's hard to believe when I look at this that that was really Saluda. It's easy to tell, especially since the road is the same height as the railroad track. And now they've built the railroad track up over the years, and it's a lot higher. But it's just amazing how things change over the years. But there's enough the old buildings there to know for sure it's Saluda and always will be.